Hi and welcome back to a new video. Today RTX 5080 Founders Edition. So we're only talking about this today and no partner cards yet. We will talk about performance and especially problems that I had with this specific Founders Edition that were mostly related to PCIe Gen 5. This video is brought to you by the Endorfy Navis AIOs, which are now available at a significantly lower price than before. For example, you can get the simple Navis F240 starting at $59.90 and the powerful F360 ARGB starting at $89.90. With a quiet pump featuring a ceramic bearing and pre-installed fluctus fans, the price-performance ratio is outstanding. You can find all the details in the link in the description. I will try to keep this video a little bit shorter than the RTX 5090 video, which looks pretty much the same from the outside, and similar to the 5090, which I also called the 4090 Ti, the 5080 somewhat behaves the same. You could also call this probably the 4080 Ti or the 4080 Super Ti. First look into 3D Mark times by Extreme GT1, and here we can see a very tiny performance uplift over the RTX 4080 by 8%. That means the FPS are increasing from 93 to 100. And if we're now looking at the more recent 3D Mark Speedway, we can see a slightly higher performance increase of 20%. So that means from 75 to 90 FPS. But on the other hand, the power consumption also increased by 3%. 3D Mark TimeSpy is an older benchmark, but it's very useful to get a performance estimate of new cards versus older games. Well, if we look at Speedway with new stuff such as ray tracing, we can get an impression of what or how the card would perform with newer games. Overall, we will get to the individual games soon, but overall, the performance increase I could see across everything that I tested was 13% higher performance over a 4080, while the power consumption increased by about 4%. What we shouldn't forget is that there is also the 4080 Super. I only had one of those cards and gave it away for a good cause, but we also know that the 4080 Super was only roughly about 2% faster than a normal 4080. This would also mean that currently the conclusion of this card being 13% faster than a 4080 would mean maybe 11% faster versus a 4080 Super. All the benchmarks we're looking at today again are made in 4K, and we will always reference versus the normal 4080. And also looking at the 5080, it is slightly increased in power consumption, so the TDP is now 360 watt, whereas it was 330 watt for the normal 4080. In Assassin's Creed Mirage, I could see a performance increase of 7 to 11%, while the power consumption stayed roughly the same. If we activate DLSS in quality mode, we can increase the performance by about 30 FPS, which equals 27% in performance increase. And this also means that in the DLSS quality mode, the card is only rendering in 1440p, which reduces the load on the core and also reduces the power consumption by 9%. This is all without frame generation. The difference between a 4080 with DLSS and a 5080 with DLSS quality is only about 5% here, while the power consumption slightly decreased. In Cyberpunk, here still without ray tracing and without path tracing, the RTX 5080 is 16% faster than the previous generation, while the power consumption stayed about the same. Interestingly, the RTX 5080 in this condition with native rendering is exactly as fast as the 7900 XTX while pulling 14% less power. Now I know that this chart with ray tracing and path tracing enabled is a little bit hard to digest. So I cut this down, but you can still pause this if you want to look into the details. But the cut down version now only compares the 4080 versus the 5080. And again, in native rendering, I mean, the performance increased by 24%, but it's still overall quite slow. We're only looking at about 20 FPS on average. That's just unplayable. Only if we enable DLSS with multi-frame generation, we can reach the area of playable frames. DLSS quality and multi-frame generation allows to push the performance times 6. And if we go to DLSS performance, it's also a plus of 800%. I already mentioned this in my RTX 5090 review that I think those DLSS and multi-frame generation technologies are very useful in terms of making those unplayable scenarios somewhat playable. But they still don't feel really smooth. That's also something I pointed out. And I was looking at the minimum FPS, but you guys were right to point me towards the additional latency that is introduced. And then I also recently watched a brilliant video by Hardware Unboxed explaining everything in detail about DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation and how it often doesn't really help in those scenarios. It makes it playable, but it still doesn't feel smooth. And that most of the time it only helps you when you already have high FPS, like 100 FPS and above, I can just recommend to go and watch that video. In Counter-Strike 2, I could observe a performance increase of 17%, while also the power consumption increased by 11% over the 4080. Switching to PUBG, I could measure a 10% performance increase, while the power consumption decreased by 19%, which seemed odd to me. I'm not quite sure. This didn't feel right measuring, but I confirmed this by just repeating this 3 times and it was always the same. The performance of the RTX 5080 in Remnant 2 increased by 15%, while the power consumption stayed roughly the same. I also saw the same 15% performance uplift in Star Wars Outlaws, while in this scenario also the power consumption increased by 7%. Valorant didn't scale as much. I think that is the same as what we saw with the 5090 already. For sure, we are already to a certain degree into the CPU limit. We saw a performance uplift in the average FPS of only 4%, but 18% in the 1% low. In summary, we see a 13% performance uplift, as I said, and about 4% additional power draw, which is not as impressive. And we're now getting to maybe the more exciting stuff, but not in a positive regard. We will talk about cooling and PCIe Gen 5. We will start with the Gen 5 stuff. In general, we did a video about this already a few days ago, detailing how much performance you lose stepping down with the 5090 from Gen 5 to Gen 4 to Gen 3. Overall, you lose about 2% each time you step down in the PCIe generation. And I also want to point out the setup I have been using. And this is an X870E Hero from Asus with a 9800X 3D. So that's pretty much state-of-the-art tech, and I think this is very realistic hardware combination of what might work together in a gaming PC with either a 5090 or a 5080. And each GPU that you saw in all of the charts, may it be 7900 XTX, 2080, 4080, 4090, 5090, everything was tested on this setup. I tested and retested everything in the previous weeks. Nothing was changed. Same OS, same BIOS, same everything. The only issues I had was with the 5080. It started right from the beginning. When I plugged in the card the first time, switched on the PSU, pressed start, no display signal. And then, do power cycle, reset the card a couple of times, and then finally, after a few minutes, I was able to boot. I went into Windows, I installed the driver, and then restarted. Again, card was not detected. I was like, what is going on? And again, did the same procedure, switch off power supply, reset the card, switch it back on until it was detected, until I got a display signal. I went into Windows and I started 3D Mark just to get my very first impression of the performance of the 5080. That was the first time I put load on the card. And then in 3D Mark, I observed like 50, maybe 60 FPS, which was just much lower than what the 4080 had. And I was like, something can't be right. And then I did the typical check, which I'm usually doing before taking actual benchmark runs. So I have like a protocol I'm going through, checking all the settings, CPU speed, memory speed, whatever. And one part is also the PCIe speed. So I checked in GPU-C, and then after full screen test, bottom left, I could see that the card was only running at X8 1.1 speed, which is just much lower than the expected X16 5.0. I then decided to force Gen 5 in the BIOS settings. Typically, I leave it on auto for auto detection because I switch back and forth between multiple cards most of the time. But then with forcing Gen 5 and again a couple of restarts, I was able to boot with Gen 5 and X16. Then started testing. 3D Mark worked fine, a couple of other games worked fine, and then I started Valorant, which didn't work fine. So Valorant, I started it and it just immediately crashed. I couldn't even get to the menu. It just like start, crash multiple times. Then I had to, do the restarting power cycle, reseating the card. And at a certain point, it was working. Then I finished Valorant. I went into PUBG. Basically same thing. I went into PUBG after not even 1 minute, got PUBG crash report, which happens a lot. PUBG is not a great game in that regard. But then after opening PUBG again, immediately, again, same crash report, yeah. Then also in Remnant 2, random freezes. And that's all stuff I never had with any of the other cards I was testing. The problem is that most of the time, if you're seeing this type of behavior, random crashes, you can't really tell what it is. It could be anything from a broken motherboard, CPU, IMC, memory, whatever, driver issues, it could be anything. But in this case, knowing that I tested all the cards before and even the 5090, which is not that much different to the 5080. Even this worked fine, but the 5080 didn't. So then I switched the 5080 to Gen 4. Repeated everything and everything was working fine. From, I don't know, over 10 cold starts, restarting, driver installation, whatever, nothing was an issue in Gen 4. Switched back to Gen 5 and the same stuff happened again. That I couldn't get the display signal and everything. So it seems to be clear that it is a Gen 5 issue. I also talked with multiple reviewers about this topic and a lot of people seem to have issues with Gen 5. There's also Optimus. He recently built a mini ITX PC with a riser cable, but still he had to switch down to Gen 4 eventually to just get around all those crashes and bugs that he was experiencing. But from what he said in the video, it felt exactly like what I was experiencing, with the only difference that I was not even using a riser cable. Also, Igor's Lab reported about this in his initial 5090 review, and he also stated that a possible cause, and I think this sounds plausible even though it's not technically proven yet, might be the way how the card is built, that you have this main PCB in the center and then the extra PCB on the bottom, which somewhat acts like an additional riser cable or riser PCB that you have sitting in between. So that might introduce additional, I don't know, mistakes in, I don't know, signaling quality or whatever. That seems like this card is running a little bit more on the edge maybe than other Gen 5 cards, because I also have other 5080 cards and other 5090 cards, and none of them having issues. It only seems to be related to the Founders Edition right now. And I'm already looking forward to if this is going to be the next drama topic. 4090, we had the 12-volt high power, and now we maybe have Gen 5 issues. We will see. Now about the cooling topic. If we look at the 5090, we already know now that the Founders Edition is quite capable of dissipating those 575 watts at also a quite good noise level. And then you might think, okay, the 5080 only 360 watts of TDP, and it's exactly the same cooler. It also comes with liquid metal. So this card should be much better, right? So might run a lot colder or a lot cooler or a lot more quiet. Seems like that's not the case. We're first looking again into Star Wars Outlaws, now first with the RTX 5090. The 50 decibels you could just see was the noise level of the card measured from 20 centimeters distance. You can see the GPU pulling 550 to 560 watts. GPU is about 80 degrees Celsius under load, memory at about 90 degrees Celsius under load. The fans are spinning at about 1700 RPM and the GPU clock is about 2700 megahertz. Yeah, I mean, I just smoothly wanted to change into the 5080 data, but same thing again. Driver installed, no more display signal. Well, finally got it going after a lot of reboots and reseating again. And now 47 to 47.5 decibels for the 5080. And the reason for this we can see here. GPU power draw is slightly below the TDP, same as with the 5090. The GPU temperature is about 10 degrees Celsius lower, memory temperature is about 12-13 degrees Celsius lower. The fan speed is about 120 to 130 RPM lower, which is not that much. GPU clock is about 50 megahertz higher. In the side-by-side comparison on the left, the 5080, on the right, the 5090, you can see it again in detail. We can see a difference in power draw by about 38%. While the overall difference in terms of noise level, which we could already see in the 3 decibels difference, and also the fan speed, is not much different. It seems like there are two different reasons why those cards act almost the same. First of all, it is that the 5080 seems to have a lower temperature target. Temperature target seems to be about 70 degrees Celsius for the 5080 and about 80 degrees Celsius for the 5090. That could be because the 5080 clocks slightly higher, so it might be relevant for stability that the card stays colder. The second and probably more relevant explanation or reason for this is the power density. If we look at the GB202 of the 5090, it is a fairly large chip for the power consumption. And it's the opposite for the 5080. It's a much smaller chip and a fairly high power consumption. So the energy density in terms of how many watts per square millimeter, it is a lot worse on the 5080. The GB202 with 750 square millimeters will have a power density of 0.77 watt per square millimeter. Now the GB203 of the RTX 5080 is a lot smaller. only 378 square millimeters, also lower TDP with only 360 watts, but due to the small size, the power density is higher with 0.95 watt per square millimeters. This means that the RTX 5080, at least compared to the size of the die, the GPU has to dissipate 23% more power density. Those two factors together should explain why both cards in the end act roughly the same in terms of noise level and also roughly in terms of temperatures. And I think that might be one of the good reasons to look into the partner cards from MSI Gigabyte ASUS, because they're not restricted, or well, they're not restricting themselves too much in terms of the height of the cooler. I think a triple or quad slot cooler even might just be better in terms of noise level in the end. And depending how much space you have in your PC, it might not make sense to just squeeze it down as Nvidia did, maybe have a bigger cooler and thus better noise levels. And talking about noise levels, one thing that I liked about the RTX 5080 was the coil whine, which was just so much better than the RTX 5090. Here I criticized it, I didn't like it, it was way too much, but on the 5080 I think the coil whine was pretty awesome, like almost not noticeable, even though it is an open build where you can typically hear it a little bit more, but even here that was really good. Overall, the RTX 5080 was not an impressive card to review. Similar to the 5090, it felt more like a TI card. So the 5090 could have been the 4090 Ti, and this maybe the 4080 Ti or 4080 Super Ti, I'm not sure, but at least the generational improvement, was just not impressive. We see 9% higher TDP, we see 13% higher performance, which seems okay as long as the price, I would say, is not higher than an extra of 10% over the 4080 Super. If this card is more than 10% more expensive than a 4080 Super, it might just make sense to get the 4080 Super instead, because honestly, there's not a big gain, not a big benefit why you would get it. Well, this might have multi-frame generation, but the 4080 Super also had normal frame generation, if this is relevant or a good idea for you. Talking about good ideas, I'm not sure if it was a good idea to have these cards with PCIe Gen 5 and the issues that I experienced. Something we will definitely keep looking into. Thanks for tuning in, see you next time.